Rain hammered the windshield the night her ex called her disposable. She didn't know the stranger who pulled her from the wreckage seconds later was the most feared man in Seoul, and that the moment his hand found her pulse, something buried in his chest clawed back to life. He had buried his heart in blood and silence for 10 years. She had buried her pride and shame for 1. Neither of them knew that fate was about to collide two broken people into a love strong enough to burn an empire down. Stay until the end, because what he does for her in the final 20 minutes will break you. If you believe love can survive humiliation, danger, and the past, type I believe in the comments right now, hit subscribe before you forget, and let's begin. Rain fell over Seoul in long silver sheets, blurring the neon into watercolor smears across wet asphalt. Inside a small, overpriced Italian restaurant near Gangnam, Zora sat across from the man she had loved for 3 years, listening to him dismantle her with a smile still on his face. "You're 32, Zora," Minho said, swirling his wine like the words cost him nothing. "I need someone who still has options. You're too old to be my wife." The restaurant didn't go silent. The world did. Zora's fingers tightened around the stem of her water glass. She had worn the blue dress because he once said blue suited her. She had ordered the salmon because it was cheaper, because she'd been saving for the wedding he'd never planned to give her. She looked at him, really looked, and saw nothing she recognized. "Say that again," she said quietly. He laughed, low and careless, glancing toward the next table where a younger woman in a red coat was watching with poorly hidden curiosity. "Don't make a scene. We had a good run. But you're not exactly 25 anymore, and I have a company to think about. Image matters." She stood. Her chair scraped against the floor like a verdict. "You don't have to make this dramatic," he said, almost bored. "I'm not the one being dramatic," she answered. "I'm the one leaving." She walked out into the rain without her coat. Across the city, 20 minutes earlier, Han Sung-joon stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of a private suite on the 40th floor, watching the storm swallow the skyline. Below him, the city he controlled, quietly, completely, without ever appearing in a single headline, pulsed with light like something alive and unaware of the hand around its throat. 3 men in dark suits waited behind him, the air thick with the kind of silence that only existed in rooms where bad news was about to be delivered. "The shipment was intercepted," one of them finally said. "Someone tipped off the Busan line." Sung-joon didn't turn around. "Someone, or someone specific?" "We think it's the O family. They've been getting bold since your father passed." His jaw tightened, the only visible sign that the words had landed. 10 years ago he had taken control of an empire built by men who mistook fear for loyalty. He had spent every year since making sure no one made that mistake about him. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. "Find out for certain," he said. "And get the car ready. I have somewhere to be." "Sir, in this weather?" "The car," he repeated, and the room emptied. He didn't know why he needed to leave. He told himself it was claustrophobia, the suite, the men, the bad news stacking like debt. He told himself a lot of things that night that turned out to be lies he hadn't caught yet. Same night, a few streets away. Zora walked without direction, the rain soaking through the blue dress, mascara running in thin gray rivers she didn't bother to wipe. Cars hissed past on the wet road. She didn't notice the black sedan slow at the intersection behind her, didn't notice it because she wasn't looking for anything except a place to fall apart in private. She stepped off the curb too soon. Headlights. A horn. The screech of brakes against wet asphalt loud enough to wake the dead. She didn't remember deciding to freeze. She remembered the heat of an arm locking around her waist, yanking her backward with a force that knocked the air from her lungs, remembered the world spinning and the ground rushing up to meet her shoulder instead of her skull. A truck roared past close enough that she felt the wind of it against her bare legs. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. She was on the ground, half sheltered under a stranger's arm, his coat soaked through, his breathing controlled even though his pulse, she could feel it against her back, was not. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, even, Korean clipped with the kind of authority that didn't ask twice. She tried to sit up. Pain flared in her shoulder. I'm fine. You're not. He helped her up anyway, hands careful in a way that contradicted the granite set of his jaw, the dangerous stillness in his eyes. He was tall, dressed in black, water running off him like he'd been carved from something that didn't feel cold. You stepped into traffic. I wasn't paying attention. I noticed. He studied her for a beat too long. Up close, under the streetlight, her makeup ruined and her dress plastered to a body she'd spent a decade being told to apologize for. Something in his chest did something it hadn't done in 10 years. It moved. He didn't have a word for it yet. He would, eventually. For now he only knew it felt like a door he thought he'd welded shut. Where's your coat? He asked. I left it behind. With someone. It wasn't a question, and the way she flinched answered it anyway. Get in the car, he said. You'll get sick standing here. I don't know you. Han Sung-jun. He said it like a fact, not an introduction. Get in the car. She should have said no. Every rational instinct told her to say no. A strange man, a black sedan, a city full of stories about women who got into cars and disappeared. But there was something in the quiet command of his voice, something that didn't feel like danger so much as gravity, and she was so tired of being the one who had to be careful, so tired of being told what she was too old or too much or not enough for. She got in the car. 20 minutes later. Inside the sedan. The driver said nothing. The rain drummed against the roof. Sung-jun sat across from her, watching the city slide by the window, and didn't ask questions a normal stranger would have asked. Not where do you live, not what happened to you. Instead he reached into a compartment and handed her a folded blanket, soft and gray, smelling faintly of cedar. You're shaking, he said. It's cold. It's not just the cold. He wasn't looking at her, but he wasn't wrong either, and she hated that he wasn't wrong. Why did you help me? She asked. He considered the question longer than she expected. Because no one else was going to. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt, not from the dress, but from being seen. Minho had looked at her for 3 years and seen a woman with an expiration date. This stranger had looked at her for 30 seconds in the rain and seen something he wasn't saying out loud. You don't have to take me anywhere special, she said. Just somewhere I can call a cab. I'll take you home. You don't know where I live. Tell me. She did, mostly because arguing felt exhausting, and he relayed the address to the driver without comment. The car turned smoothly through wet streets, streetlights smearing gold across the windows. What's your name? He asked, finally, like it had cost him something to wait this long. Zora. He repeated it once, quiet, like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth. Zora. Then, after a pause that felt longer than it was, whoever made you cry in the rain is a fool. She looked at him sharply. You don't know what happened. I know you're alone, in the rain, in a dress you didn't choose to ruin, with no coat and no umbrella, walking like you didn't care if you lived or died for about 4 seconds back there. His eyes were steady, unbothered by her glare. I don't need the details to know someone failed you tonight. She didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in hours, she didn't feel like crying. She felt, strangely, like she'd been caught, not in a lie, but in a truth she hadn't said out loud yet, even to herself. The car pulled up outside her building. Rain still fell, lighter now, more mist than storm. Thank you, she said, reaching for the door. Wait. He pulled a card from his jacket, plain, cream-colored, only a number printed on it. No name, no company. If anyone bothers you again. Anyone at all. I don't need rescuing. No, he agreed, something almost like amusement in his voice. You handled the dress and the rain just fine on your own. But take it anyway. She took it because it was easier than arguing, and because some small, foolish part of her wanted an excuse to never throw it away. She didn't see him again for 6 days. She thought about him for all 6. Sung-Jun did not, as a rule, think about women. He had built an empire out of discipline, every emotion filed, labeled, locked behind a door he'd shut the year his father died and left him a syndicate instead of a family. Loyalty was currency. Fear was a tool. Love was a story other men told themselves before it got them killed. And yet, for 6 days, in board meetings, in deals brokered over imported whiskey, in the quiet hour before sleep he rarely indulged in, he thought about a woman in a soaked blue dress who had looked at him like she expected him to be one more disappointment and had been visibly unsettled when he wasn't. "You're distracted," his second-in-command, Jun Seo, observed on the 7th day, watching Sung-Jun stare at a contract he hadn't actually read in 4 minutes. "I'm thinking. About the O family?" "No." Jun Seo raised an eyebrow but said nothing further. He had worked beside Sung-Jun for 8 years and had never once seen him distracted by anything that wasn't a threat. He filed the observation away the way he filed everything, quietly, for later. That evening, Sung-Jun did something he hadn't done in a decade. He had someone look into a woman's life, not to find leverage, but because he wanted, simply and inconveniently, to know her. The file came back thin. Zora, 32, a graphic designer at a mid-size firm, recently and publicly humiliated by her boyfriend of 3 years, a junior executive named Kang Min-ho who was, as it happened, the son of a textile family Sung-Jun's organization had quiet business with. No criminal record. No family in Seoul, parents back in her hometown, a sister overseas. Steady work. Steady rent. A life built carefully, like someone who'd learned the hard way that nothing would be handed to her. He read it twice. He didn't know what he was looking for. He found himself oddly relieved that nothing in it required him to act, and oddly disappointed that nothing in it gave him a reason to see her again. He created the reason anyway. The following week, Zora's design firm had been retained, through channels she would never fully understand until much later, to rebrand a private holdings company with no public face and an unreasonable amount of money. She found out when her manager, pale with the kind of excitement reserved for landing whales, told her she'd be running point on the account personally. "They asked for you," her manager said. "By name." "Me specifically?" "You specifically." "Don't ask me why, just don't mess it up." The meeting was held not at the firm, but at a private office on the top floor of a building she'd passed 100 times without knowing what it housed. When the elevator doors opened, she recognized him immediately, the same unshaken stillness, the same eyes that looked like they were doing arithmetic on her even when his face gave nothing away. "You," she said, before she could stop herself. "Zora." Sung-Jun rose from behind his desk, and something in the economy of his movement suggested a man who rarely stood for anyone. "I hope the firm explained the brief adequately." "You requested me." "By name." She crossed her arms. "Why?" "Your portfolio was impressive." "My portfolio is 6 months old." "You couldn't have seen it unless someone went looking." His mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I go looking for a lot of things. This feels like a coincidence that isn't one. Most things that feel like coincidences aren't." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit. We have work to do, Zora. Whatever else this is, you can decide later." She sat, against every instinct telling her to leave, because the truth was simpler and more annoying than she wanted to admit. She wanted to see him again too, and a legitimate work contract was the only excuse either of them had bothered to invent. 3 weeks later. What began as 4 meetings became weekly sessions, then twice weekly, then a standing dinner that both of them pretended was discussing the brand voice. Zora told herself it was professional. She told herself a lot of things about Sung-Jun that fell apart a little more every time he did something that had nothing to do with logos or color palettes. He remembered she didn't take sugar in her coffee after the second time she mentioned it. He noticed when she favored her left shoulder, the one she'd landed on the night they met, and quietly had a doctor he trusted happen to be at the building for an unrelated reason. insisting she get it checked. He never asked about Minho directly. But once, when she mentioned in passing that her ex had started a new relationship with someone younger, Sung Jun's jaw had tightened in a way that made the temperature of the room drop several degrees, and the topic was never brought up again, though she noticed, weeks later, that the textile company her ex worked for had quietly lost 3 major contracts it had been counting on. She never asked if he was involved. Some part of her was afraid of the answer, and a smaller, more honest part of her wasn't afraid at all. She found she didn't mind. "You're staring," she told him one evening, over takeout containers spread across his office desk because he refused to let her eat alone after a long day, claiming it was inefficient, though neither of them believed that excuse anymore. "I'm thinking," he said. "About the campaign?" "No." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push, but the air between them had stopped being about deadlines weeks ago and neither of them said so out loud. A gala, 1 month after they met. The rebrand launch was held at a hotel ballroom dressed in gold and candlelight, the kind of event where everyone's smile was a transaction. Zora wore green, her choice this time, no one else's opinion attached to it, and felt, for the first night and longer than she could remember, like she belonged somewhere. She didn't expect to see Minho there. He approached during a lull in the music, a glass of champagne loose in his hand, the woman in the red coat from the restaurant trailing a step behind him like an accessory he hadn't fully committed to. "Zora." He said her name like an apology he had no intention of giving. "Look at you. Did you finally take my advice and update your image?" "Minho. This is quite the upgrade for you." His eyes flicked over the room, the gold, the staff, the unmistakable scale of money on display. "Whose event is this? You can't possibly be the host." "I'm working it," she said evenly. "Professionally." "Of course you are." He smiled, the kind of smile designed to be witnessed by an audience. "Still trying to prove you matter, even now. It's almost admirable." She felt the old shame rise in her chest, fast and familiar, the way it always had around him, and then she felt something else arrive behind her, a presence rather than a sound. A shift in the air like weather changing. "Is there a problem here?" Sung Jun's voice was quiet. It was the quiet that mattered. The room around them seemed to register it before the words even landed. 2 security men near the door straightened without being told to. Minho turned, recognition arriving slowly and then all at once, his confidence audibly deflating. "Mr. Han. I didn't realize, forgive me, I didn't know you two were acquainted." "You don't need to know the nature of our acquaintance," Sung Jun said. "You only need to know that the next thing you say to her will determine whether your company keeps the contracts it has left." Minho's mouth opened and closed. The woman in red took a visible step backward. Of course. My apologies, Zora. I didn't mean." "You did," Sung Jun said. "You always mean it. That's the part you should be ashamed of." He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't have to. Minho excused himself with the speed of a man who had just understood, for the first time, the actual size of the room he'd been standing in. Zora stood very still, heart loud in her ears. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It's better." He studied her face, the flush of humiliation slowly draining from it, replaced by something steadier. "He called you too old. I've spent a month watching you build something he never noticed you were capable of. He was wrong about the number, Zora. He was wrong about everything." She didn't trust her voice, so she said nothing, and he let the silence sit there between them, warm instead of awkward, the kind of silence that 2 people built when they'd run out of reasons to keep pretending something wasn't happening. Later that night, on the hotel balcony. The party noise dimmed behind glass doors. The city spread beneath them, lit and indifferent. "Can I ask you something?" Zora said, arms crossed against the cold, though she suspected the cold wasn't really the reason. "Yes." "What do you actually do, Han Sung Jun?" "My manager wouldn't even tell me the legal name of your company." "Nobody seems to know." He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that told her the answer mattered more than the question implied. I run several businesses, he said carefully. Some of them are exactly what they appear to be. Some of them are not. I would rather not lie to you by pretending otherwise, and I would rather not tell you more than you're prepared to hear yet. That's not an answer. No, he admitted. It's a warning. There's a difference between the two, and I'd like you to know which one I'm giving you. She studied him in the half-light, the careful stillness that never quite relaxed, the way even his kindness carried an edge of restraint, like he was holding something back at all times. A warning about what? About me, he said simply. About what it might cost to be close to someone like me. Are you trying to scare me off? I'm trying to be honest before it's too late to be. He turned to face her fully then, something raw moving behind his usual composure. I haven't wanted anything for myself in 10 years, Zora. I learned a long time ago that wanting things makes you weak, and weak men in my position don't survive. And then you stepped off a curb in the rain, and I haven't stopped wanting since. The confession landed harder than she expected, stripped of any performance, said like it cost him something to say it out loud. I don't know what to do with that, she admitted. You don't have to do anything with it tonight. His hand came up, slow, and brushed a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that didn't match anything else about him. I only wanted you to know it was true. She didn't pull away. That, more than anything, told her everything she needed to know about where this was already headed. By the following week, Zora had stopped pretending the meetings were only about work, and so had he. He started showing up to her favorite coffee shop before her shift, always with the order she hadn't told him she'd switch to. He started sending his car when it rained, no explanation given, no argument accepted. Small things. Quiet things. The kind of devotion that didn't announce itself but simply arrived, every time, like whether she could now set her watch by. You don't have to keep doing this, she told him one morning, climbing into the car he'd sent without being asked. I know. Then why do you? Because I want to, he said, like it was the simplest fact in the world, and in his world, perhaps it was. A work dinner, 2 weeks later. The client appreciation dinner brought together half the city's quiet money, the kind of room where everyone smiled with their teeth and measured each other with their eyes. Zora stood near the bar, half listening to a junior associate from a rival firm flirt with the kind of confidence men only had when they assumed every woman in the room was available. You're wasted on design work, he said, leaning in slightly too close. A woman like you should be running her own studio. Maybe I could help with that. I'm fine where I am, Zora said, stepping back half a foot. Modest too. I like that. He reached out, fingers brushing her elbow in a way that crossed a line she hadn't invited him to cross. The hand was gone before she registered who had removed it. Sung Joon had crossed the room without seeming to move quickly at all, and now stood between them with a stillness that made the temperature plummet. You should find your seat, he told the associate. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. We were just talking, the man said, color draining from his face as he registered exactly whose dinner this was. You are touching something that isn't yours to touch. Sung Joon's voice stayed level, almost pleasant, which somehow made it worse. I'd suggest you remember the difference for the rest of the evening. The associate disappeared into the crowd without another word. Zora turned to Sung Joon, equal parts grateful and irritated. I can handle a flirt at a party, Sung Joon. I know you can. Then why? Because I didn't want to watch it. His jaw was tight, a muscle ticking at the corner. I have stood in rooms with armed men and felt less out of control than I did watching him touch your arm. He exhaled slowly, like he was working to put something back where it belonged. I don't like this feeling. I don't know what to do with it. It's called jealousy, she said, almost gently, surprised to find herself charmed by a feared man's confusion over something so human. I'm aware of the word, he said. I had simply never needed it before. She laughed, really laughed, for the first time and longer than she could remember, and something in his shoulders eased at the sound of it, like he'd been waiting all night for permission to relax. For what it's worth, she said, quieter now, I didn't want him touching me either. But I like that you came over anyway. Why? Because you didn't do it like you owned me. You did it like you were protecting something you respected. She held his gaze. There's a difference, and most men your level of powerful never learn it. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close enough that she felt it land somewhere under her ribs. The following morning, Jun Seo found Sung Jun in his office before sunrise, a folder in his hand and an expression that told Sung Jun this wasn't going to be the kind of morning either of them wanted. The O family confirmed the leak, Jun Seo said. It traced back to someone inside our Busan operation. We pulled the thread and it leads further than we expected. How far? Far enough that the woman you've been seeing might be a problem. Sung Jun's expression didn't move, but the air around him went very still, the way it did right before he made a decision someone would regret. Explain. Her ex-boyfriend's family, the Kong Textile Group, they've taken a financial beating since you cut their contracts. We found communications between someone in that family and a contact tied to the O family. They're looking for leverage against you. Something personal. Something that would make you bleed without anyone needing to touch your business directly. They're looking at Zora. We think so. Nothing's happened yet. But if the Kong family is feeding information to people who want to hurt you, and they know about her, they don't touch her. Sung Jun's voice dropped to something low and absolute. Whatever this costs. Whatever it takes. She doesn't become collateral in something she has no part of. Understood. Jun Seo hesitated. Sir, for what it's worth. I haven't seen you like this in 10 years. Not since before your father. Don't finish that sentence. I wasn't going to, Jun Seo said quietly, though they both knew the sentence had already been understood. I was going to say it's good to see. Whatever else this becomes. Sung Jun said nothing, but something in him, the part that had spent 10 years convincing himself that caring about anyone was a liability he couldn't afford, quietly, permanently lost the argument it had been having with itself. That evening, Zora hadn't planned to confront him. She'd planned, if anything, to ask a simple question over dinner about why his security detail had quietly doubled outside her apartment building over the past 3 days without explanation. But the moment she stepped into his office and saw the exhaustion behind his composure, the kind of tired that came from carrying something he hadn't told her about, the simple question became something else entirely. Something's wrong, she said, closing the door behind her. Don't tell me it isn't. I've watched you handle 100 problems without it touching your face. This one is touching your face. He didn't deny it. That, more than anything, frightened her. There are people, he said slowly, who would like to use you to hurt me. I won't pretend otherwise to you. I respect you too much to lie. Use me how? I don't know yet. And until I do, I need you closer, not further away, which I understand sounds like the worst possible thing to ask a woman who values her independence as much as you do. She crossed the room and stood in front of him, closer than strictly necessary, close enough that she could see the fine tension along his jaw, the restraint he wore like armor even now. You've spent a month taking care of me without asking permission for any of it, she said. Cars in the rain. Doctors who happened to be there. A man at a party who learned not to touch me again. You've been protecting me since the night you pulled me off that curb, Sung Jun. Did you think I hadn't noticed? I didn't want you to feel like a responsibility. I don't feel like one. Her voice softened, dropped to something unguarded. I feel like someone finally sees me as more than a number on a calendar. His hand came up slowly, cradling her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted everything the world believed about him. You are so much more than that, he said, voice rough in a way she hadn't heard from him before. You terrify me, Zora. I have run from very little in my life. I have wanted to run from you since the night I met you, because I knew the moment I touched your pulse in the rain, that I would burn down everything I've built before I let anyone take you from me. "That's not exactly romantic," she whispered, though her breath had already gone unsteady. "No," he agreed, leaning closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. "It's a promise." The space between them disappeared. What followed was not shown in detail, only felt. The careful unmaking of distance. The quiet that fell over the room like a held breath. His hand at her waist, hers at the collar of his shirt, the world outside the windows narrowing to nothing as two people who had spent their lives being careful finally stopped being careful with each other. There was no need for anything explicit to tell the truth of that night, only the warmth of it, the trembling closeness, the way his voice broke once against her hair when he said her name like a vow, and the way she fell asleep, finally, fully, in arms that had spent a month proving they would not let her fall anywhere else. Zora woke before dawn to gray light filtering through unfamiliar curtains, Sung-Jun's arm heavy and warm across her waist, his breathing slow and even against the back of her neck. For a few suspended seconds, she let herself feel only safe. Then the fear arrived, the way it always did, dragging old wreckage behind it. He'll wake up and realize what he's done. He'll see you the way Minho saw you, too much, too complicated, too far past the age where men like him are supposed to want women like you. This was a moment. Moment's end. She slipped out from under his arm before the panic could grow any louder, dressed quietly in the dim light, and left before he woke, leaving nothing behind but the cold space where she'd been. She told herself it was self-preservation. She told herself leaving first meant she wouldn't have to watch him decide she wasn't worth keeping. She did not yet understand that running from a man like Han Sung-Jun was not the same as running from a man like Minho. Men like Minho let you go because keeping you required effort they weren't willing to spend. Men like Sung-Jun did not know how to let go at all. That morning, he woke to an empty bed and went very, very still. For one full minute, he simply lay there, registering the absence the way he might register the absence of a guard who should have been at his post, or wrongness in the architecture of the morning. Then he was moving, methodical despite the unfamiliar panic clawing up his throat, checking the apartment, finding her coat gone, her shoes gone, no note, no message, nothing. He called her. It went to voicemail. He called again. Same result. By the fourth attempt, Junaseo found him in the hallway, fully dressed, jaw set in the particular stillness that his men had learned, over the years, to fear more than shouting. "Sir? Get the car. Has something happened with the O family?" "No." Sung-Jun's voice was tight, controlled, betraying nothing except the faintest crack at the edges. "Something happened with Zora." Junaseo, wisely, asked no further questions, and got the car. Zora's apartment, an hour later. She'd barely changed out of yesterday's clothes when the knock came, 3 measured raps, neither hesitant nor aggressive, the knock of a man who'd come because he intended to and would keep coming until someone answered. She opened the door already knowing who it would be. Sung-Jun stood in the hallway, composure visibly costing him more than it usually did, eyes scanning her face like he was confirming she was real, whole, unharmed. "You left," he said. "I needed air. You left before I woke up. You didn't answer 4 calls. That isn't air, Zora. That's running." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly exposed in a way that had nothing to do with clothing. "What did you expect me to do? Wait around for you to realize this was a mistake? I know how this story usually ends for me. This isn't that story." His voice dropped, urgent now, stripped of its usual control. "I have spent 10 years building walls so thick that nothing could get through them, Zora, and you got through in one rainy night without even trying. Do you understand what that means to a man like me? I don't fall into things. I don't make mistakes I don't account for in advance. Last night wasn't a mistake. It was the first thing in a decade that felt like it mattered more than survival. You don't know that. Not really. It's been a month. I knew it the night I pulled you off that curb," he said, quiet and absolute. "Everything since has only confirmed it. You can run from me as many times as you need to, Zora, and I will come find you every single time, because I am done pretending I don't want this. I am done being careful with you. I would rather burn this entire city to the ground than spend one more morning waking up to an empty bed because you were too afraid to believe I meant what I said. Her resolve, built so carefully over years of disappointment, cracked clean through. I'm scared, she admitted, voice breaking. I'm scared that I'm the thing that gets used against you. I heard you talking to your men yesterday, Sung-Jun. I heard enough to know there are people who'd hurt me to hurt you. I'm scared that loving you is going to be the thing that gets me killed, or the thing that makes you choose between me and everything you've built, and either way I lose. He crossed the threshold without being invited and pulled her into his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head like she was something he'd nearly lost and had only just gotten back. Then let me be scared with you, he murmured into her hair. Let me carry that with you instead of watching you carry it alone in an apartment with the door locked against me. I am not going anywhere, Zora. Not for the O family. Not for your fear. Not for anything. She didn't run again. By the end of that week, what had been quiet devotion became unmistakable. He moved a second security detail to her building without asking, and for once she didn't argue, because she'd started to understand that this wasn't control, it was the only language he had for love that he trusted completely. You don't have to keep apologizing for caring about me, she told him one evening, watching him personally check the locks on her apartment door for the third time that week. I'm not apologizing, he said. I'm making sure. There's a difference between making sure and hovering. I'm aware, he said, and didn't stop checking the locks. She laughed, and let him. 2 weeks later. Life, against every instinct Zora had trained into herself, began to feel steady. She kept her apartment, kept her job, kept her independence, but most evenings ended with Sung-Jun's car waiting outside her building, and most mornings began with a message that simply said eat something before you leave. She told her closest friend, a fellow designer named Hannah, about him in careful, edited pieces, leaving out the parts that would require explaining what exactly Sung-Jun's business was. He sounds intense, Hannah said, sipping her coffee with the particular skepticism of someone who had watched Zora survive Min-ho. Intense in a good way, or intense in a way I should be worried about? Intense in a way I didn't know I needed, Zora admitted. He makes me feel like the years Min-ho counted against me were never a debt in the first place. That's either the most romantic thing you've ever said, or the beginning of a cautionary tale, Hannah said. I genuinely can't tell which yet. Zora laughed, but some old instinct in her chest agreed that the truth was probably somewhere in between, and that the cautionary part hadn't shown its face yet only because it hadn't needed to. The twist begins. A name from Sung-Jun's past. It started with a woman Zora had never seen before, sitting in the lobby of Sung-Jun's building when Zora arrived for what was meant to be a quiet dinner. Elegant, composed, dressed in cream silk that looked like it had never once been rained on, the woman rose when she saw Zora approach the elevator. You must be Zora, the woman said, her smile pleasant in the specific way that made Zora's instincts prickle. I'm Nari. Sung-Jun and I were engaged once. A long time ago, before he decided the family business mattered more than I did. Zora's stomach dropped, though her face gave away nothing. I didn't know he'd been engaged. There's quite a lot you probably don't know, Nari said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because my family still does business with his, and I wanted to see for myself what kind of woman finally cracked Sung-Jun open after all these years. Her eyes swept over Zora with an appraisal that wasn't unkind, exactly, but wasn't warm either. He used to say he'd never let anyone close enough to use against him. I see that's changed. What happened between you two? Ask him, Nari said simply. If he tells you the truth, you'll understand a great deal about why he is the way he is. If he doesn't, she shrugged, gathering her coat. Then you'll have learned something important about him a different way. She left before Zora could respond, and the unease she left behind sat heavy in Zora's chest the entire elevator ride up. That evening. Nari, Sung-Jun repeated when Zora told him, and something closed over his expression like a door sliding shut on rusted hinges. She came to see you. She said you were engaged. We were. He set down the glass in his hand, the motion careful, controlled, the way he moved when he was buying himself time. 10 years ago. Around the time my father died. What happened? He was quiet long enough that she nearly repeated the question. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual command in it. My father was killed by a rival faction during a power struggle I was too young and too unprepared to see coming. Nari's family had business ties to the men responsible. When it came time for me to take control, I learned that her father had known about the plot in advance and said nothing, because a war between our families benefited his bottom line either way. And Nari? She knew. She chose her family over telling me. His jaw tightened. I ended the engagement the week I buried my father. I told myself afterward that the lesson was simple, that closeness was a liability, that anyone you let close enough to matter was someone who could be turned into a weapon against you eventually, whether they meant to be or not. I built the last 10 years around never repeating that mistake. Until me. Until you, he agreed, and the admission cost him something visible, a vulnerability he rarely allowed daylight. I told myself I was protecting you from my world. The truth is I was protecting myself from feeling something I thought I'd buried with my father. You undid 10 years of careful armor in one rainy night, Zora, and some days I still don't know whether to thank you or resent you for it. She crossed the room and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his with a steadiness she didn't entirely feel. I'm not her, she said. I won't choose anything over telling you the truth. I need you to believe that, even when it's hard. I do believe it, he said. That's precisely why this terrifies me more than anything Nari's family or the O family could ever do. The real twist. It came 3 days later, delivered not by an enemy but by June SEO, in the careful, measured tone he used only when delivering news that would change everything. We finished tracing the leak, June SEO said, closing the office door behind him. It wasn't the Kong family feeding the O family information for leverage against you, the way we assumed. Then who? It was Nari's family. They'd been quietly funding the O family's expansion for the past year, positioning themselves to absorb territory once the dust settled. The leverage they wanted wasn't about hurting you through Zora. June SEO hesitated. It was about repairing the engagement. Nari approached Zora not as a rival, sir. She came to assess whether removing Zora from the picture would be enough to bring you back into alignment with her family's interests. Her visit to Zora wasn't a warning. It was reconnaissance. Sung Jun's expression went dangerously still. She used the appearance of honesty to test whether Zora would run. That's our assessment, yes. And if Zora hadn't told me about the visit, then Nari's family would have known exactly how much pressure it would take to break what you've built with her, June SEO said. Sir, for what it's worth, Zora telling you immediately is the reason this didn't work. If she'd hidden it, even out of insecurity, even out of fear of how you'd react to hearing Nari's name, we wouldn't know any of this yet. Sung Jun sat with that for a long moment, the realization that the very honesty he'd feared losing, the thing Nari's family had once cost him, was the exact thing Zora had given him without hesitation, the moment it mattered most. Bring me everything you have on the Onari Alliance, he said finally. Quietly. I want this handled before it ever reaches her doorstep again. That night. He tells her everything. He didn't soften it. He laid out the entire truth on her kitchen table like evidence in a trial, Nari's reconnaissance, the O family's expansion, the danger that had circled closer than either of them had let on. Why are you telling me all of this? She asked, when he finished. You could have handled it quietly and let me never know how close it came. Because you told me the truth about Nari the moment it happened, even though you had every reason to be afraid of what it might do to us. He held her gaze, steady despite the weight of what he was admitting. I won't repay that with the kind of silence that cost me my father. You deserve to know exactly what loving me costs, Zora, and exactly what I intend to do to make sure it never costs you anything more than the truth. What do you intend to do? End it, he said simply. Permanently. Not with violence dressed up as necessity. I've spent 10 years learning the difference between strength and cruelty, and I won't cross that line for revenge. But the O family's expansion ends, and Nari's family loses every advantage they thought they had, starting this week. That sounds dangerous. It is. He didn't pretend otherwise. But it's a danger I chose with clear eyes, for a reason I'd choose again every time. You. By the following week, Sung-Jun moved with the precision of a man dismantling a threat piece by piece rather than smashing it apart and risking the wreckage hitting everyone nearby. Contracts dissolved. Alliances Nari's family had spent a year building quietly collapsed, redirected through channels that left no fingerprints and no body count, only ruin, financial and complete, the kind of consequence that mattered more to men like the O family than any threat of violence ever could. But desperation makes men reckless, and the O family, watching their carefully built leverage evaporate, made the one mistake Sung-Jun hadn't fully anticipated. They came after Zora directly, not to take her, but to frighten her into leaving him before her presence cost them anything further. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, no melodrama, no struggle, only a car that idled too long outside her building, two men who watched her walk to the corner store and back with the unmistakable patience of surveillance rather than coincidence, and a note left tucked beneath her windshield wiper that read, simply, "Walk away from him while you still can." She didn't panic. She photographed the note, called Sung-Jun immediately, and sat in her locked apartment with her heart hammering against her ribs while she waited for him to arrive, proof, even in fear, that she had learned the difference between running and standing her ground. He arrived in under 9 minutes. "Show me," he said, the moment he was through the door, and when she handed him her phone, the stillness that came over his face was the most frightening thing she'd seen from him yet, not because it was violent, but because it was absolute. "They didn't touch you," he said, more to himself than to her, checking her hands, her face, like he needed the physical confirmation more than her words. "They didn't get close. Just a note. Just watching. That's enough." His voice was low, controlled, devastating in its calm. "That's more than enough. That night. I need you to understand something," he said, sitting across from her at her kitchen table, his hands wrapped around hers like he was afraid letting go would cost him something irreplaceable. "I am not going to ask you to leave the city, or hide, or change your life to accommodate their fear tactics. I am also not going to pretend this didn't happen, or that it couldn't happen again before this is fully finished." "Then what are you going to do?" "End it," he said. "Completely, this time. Not contracts. Not quiet financial ruin. I am going to make certain that touching you, even from a distance, even with nothing but a note on a windshield, becomes the single most expensive mistake anyone in this city could make. I will not raise a hand to you, Zora. I will not let this become the kind of story where you're a prize fought over with violence. But I will burn down every advantage, every alliance, every cent of leverage the O family has left, until there is nothing left of their threat to fear." "That sounds like it could get you killed." "It could," he agreed, with the kind of honesty that made her chest ache. "But the alternative is watching you live in fear of a windshield note for the rest of your life, and I find I would rather risk everything I am than ask you to carry that. You are not collateral, Zora. You are the reason any of this is worth surviving." She reached up, cupping his face in both hands, feeling the tension in his jaw ease slightly under her touch. "Then let me help." "Absolutely not. Sung-Jun. I mean it, Zora. This is not a negotiation." "It wasn't a request," she said, steady despite the way her pulse raced. "I'm a graphic designer. I notice patterns, inconsistencies, the things people try to hide in plain sight. If there's something in the O family's public materials, their shell companies, their branding fronts, anything that could expose the cracks faster, I can find it. Let me use the one skill that's actually mine in this." He studied her for a long moment, torn between the instinct to protect her from every shadow in his world and the dawning understanding that doing so would mean denying the very strength that had made him fall for her in the first place. "On one condition," he said finally. "Name it." "You do it from inside this building, with my security around you at all times, until this is finished." I will not compromise on that. Deal, she said, and meant it. 3 days later. Zora's contribution wasn't dramatic, no chases, no confrontations, only long nights at a borrowed desk, cross-referencing shell company registrations against branding patterns she recognized from corporate design work, the kind of administrative fingerprints that careless men leave behind when they assume no one is looking closely enough to notice. She found it on the second night, a logo design, commissioned 18 months earlier through an obscure design contractor, for a shell company that, on paper, had nothing to do with the O family, except that the same contractor had also designed a near-identical logo for a company Sung Joon's team had already flagged as an O family front 3 years prior. The visual fingerprint was unmistakable to a trained eye, and invisible to everyone else. This connects 6 of their shell companies in one document, Joon SEO said, staring at the trail Zora had laid out with the same disbelief he usually reserved for enemy intelligence failures. It would have taken us months to find this through financial records alone. I told you design work mattered, Zora said, exhausted but lit from within with something like pride. Sung Joon looked at the evidence, then at her, something fierce and unguarded moving across his face. You just dismantled in 2 nights what an entire intelligence team couldn't find in 2 months. I had motivation, she said simply. He crossed the room and kissed her forehead with a reverence that said more than any of his usual careful words ever could. You are extraordinary, he murmured against her skin. And I am never again going to underestimate what you bring to a fight that's supposed to be mine alone. By the following week, with the shell company network exposed, what remained of the O family's expansion collapsed in days rather than weeks. Business partners withdrew. Financial backers fled the association the moment their own exposure became a risk. The O family, stripped of the leverage Nari's family had quietly funded, found themselves with nothing left to threaten Sung Joon with, and crucially, nothing left to threaten Zora with either. Nari herself, when the dust settled, sent no further visits, no further tests. The last anyone heard, her family had quietly distanced themselves from the entire affair the moment it became clear that aligning against Sung Joon was now a losing proposition rather than a strategic advantage. Whatever chapter she represented in his past, it closed not with violence, but with the unglamorous, total irrelevance that came from backing the wrong side of a war she'd started without ever truly understanding the man she was up against. It was, Zora thought, a strange kind of ending for a threat that had once felt so enormous, not a battle, but an erosion, danger dissolving into paperwork and collapsed shell companies, proof that real power didn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it announced itself by simply making certain there was nothing left to fight over. 1 month later, with the danger behind them, something in Sung Joon shifted that even Joon SEO noticed. A man who had spent 10 years keeping his life compartmentalized into separate, defensible rooms had started, deliberately, to let the walls between those rooms come down. You're bringing her to the quarterly partners' dinner, Joon SEO said, not quite a question. I am. That dinner has never had a guest who wasn't directly involved in the business. Then it's about time it did, Sung Joon said, and the matter was closed. The dinner itself was a study in quiet transformation. Men who had spent years addressing Sung Joon with careful deference now watched him pull out Zora's chair before his own, watched him lean toward her when she spoke instead of merely tolerating the interruption, watched the single, telling fact that the most feared man at the table could not stop the corner of his mouth from softening every time she laughed. Forgive my curiosity, one of the older partners said over dessert, addressing Zora directly with the boldness of a man secure enough in his standing to risk it, but I have known Han Sung Joon for 15 years, and I have never once seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. May I ask what your secret is? Zora glanced at Sung Joon, who was watching her with an open warmth he no longer bothered to hide. I didn't have a secret, she said. I think I just refused to let him be careful with me the way everyone else let him be. The table laughed. But Sung Joon's expression had gone entirely serious, fixed on her like the rest of the room had simply ceased to exist. She's right, he said quietly, to no one and everyone. She's the only person in 10 years who refused to let me hide. That same week. The story might have stayed contained to that dinner, except for the gala 2 weeks later, a charity function attended by enough of the city's elite that Min-ho, predictably, climbed the guest list through his family's lingering connections, unaware of exactly how far his fortunes had fallen since the night he'd called Zora too old in a restaurant that suddenly felt like a different lifetime. He found her near the entrance, dressed in deep crimson this time, standing beside Sung-jun with an ease that hadn't existed in her 3 years with Min-ho even on their best day. Zora. He attempted the old charm, visibly unaware it no longer had any current to run on. You look well. I heard you've been keeping interesting company. I have, she said simply. I owe you an apology, I think, he continued, glancing toward Sung-jun with poorly disguised unease. What I said that night, it wasn't fair. I was under pressure from my family, the business wasn't doing well, and I took it out on you. You deserved better. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't entirely honest either, and Zora had spent enough time around Sung-jun to recognize calculated humility when she saw it, an apology engineered for an audience, not for her. I appreciate you saying that, she said evenly. But I want to be clear about something, Min-ho. I don't need the apology anymore. I needed it the night you said it, in front of everyone, when it would have actually meant something. Now it's just words you're saying because you finally noticed who I'm standing next to. His jaw tightened, the truth landing harder than he expected. Sung-jun, who had said nothing throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had decided something was worth finishing. For what it's worth, he said, you were wrong about her age being a liability. It was never the years that made her valuable. It was everything she built in spite of people like you telling her those years didn't count for anything. He turned to Zora then, and in front of the entire room, partners, rivals, the woman in red who had once trailed Min-ho like an afterthought now watching with wide eyes, he took her hand and lifted it to his lips, a gesture so unguarded that the room around them went hushed. I am not interested in apologies that arrive only once a man realizes he's lost something valuable, Sung-jun said, loud enough now for the room to hear, though his eyes never left Zora's face. I am only interested in making sure she never again has to wonder whether she's enough for anyone, because I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that she was always more than enough for me. Min-ho said nothing further. There was nothing left to say. 3 weeks later. The night everything became permanent. Sung-jun took her, without explanation, to the same intersection where they had first collided, the curb where she'd nearly been struck, the street now dry and quiet under a clear autumn sky instead of pouring rain. Why here? She asked, though some part of her had already guessed. Because this is where I stopped being a man who only survived, and started being a man who wanted something for himself again. He took both her hands in his, the composure that ran his empire entirely absent now, replaced by something rawer, more honest than she'd ever seen from him. I have spent 10 years building walls so no one could ever again cost me what losing my father cost me. You tore through every single one of them without even trying, Zora, and instead of resenting it the way I once swore I would, I have spent every day since being grateful for it. He reached into his coat and produced a small box, his hands, steady in boardrooms, steady in the face of armed threats, visibly unsteady now. I am not a simple man to love, he continued. My world comes with danger I cannot always fully remove, with a past that occasionally arrives uninvited in cream silk, with a level of intensity one knows isn't always easy to be on the receiving end of. But I'm asking you anyway, because the alternative, a life where I never asked, is the only thing that actually frightens me anymore. He opened the box. The ring inside was simple, elegant, nothing like the ostentatious wealth he could have chosen, and exactly, perfectly her. Marry me, Zora. Not because anyone calculated it, not because it solves a problem, but because I have never wanted anything as simply and completely as I want a lifetime of mornings where you don't have a reason to run before I wake up. She was crying before he finished the sentence, the good kind of tears, the kind that came from finally being chosen by someone who meant it without conditions attached. Yes, she said, voice breaking around the word. Yes, Sung-jun. 1,000 times yes. He kissed her there on the same curb where he'd once pulled her from the rain, slow and certain, The kind of kiss that didn't need fading to black to feel like the truest thing either of them had ever done, because everyone passing by could see exactly what it was. Two people who had found, against every odds stacked against them, the one thing neither had let themselves believe they deserved. 6 months later. The ceremony was smaller than anyone expected from a man of Sungjun's standing. No spectacle, no excess, only the people who had actually mattered through the danger and the doubt. Jun Seo standing beside Sungjun with an expression of unguarded pride, Hannah dabbing at her eyes in the front row, Zora's parents, flown in from her hometown, beaming at a daughter they had watched survive humiliation and emerge, somehow, more herself than ever. Zora wore ivory, no longer anyone else's color choice, no longer borrowed from a man who'd once decided what suited her and what didn't. When she walked toward Sungjun, his composure, famous, feared, ironclad in every boardroom and every negotiation he'd ever survived, broke entirely, tears he made no effort to hide tracking down a face the world had spent a decade believing incapable of softening. "You came to me in the rain with nothing," he murmured when she reached him, voice thick with an emotion that needed no further translation, "and you have given me everything since." "You found something in me nobody else bothered looking for," she answered. "I think we found each other exactly when we both needed someone to stop being careful." They exchanged vows that were less promise than confirmation, words for something that had already, quietly, become true the night he pulled her from the rain and refused, ever since, to let her go. 1 year later. The penthouse that had once belonged only to a man who ran an empire in silence now held, on quiet Sunday mornings, the unmistakable sound of laughter that didn't used to live there, Zora's, mostly, but increasingly, unexpectedly, his too, the rare unguarded sound of Han Sungjun actually, fully happy. She found him one such morning standing at the same window where he'd once watched the storm the night they met, except now his hand rested, with a tenderness that still occasionally caught her off guard, against the gentle curve beginning to show beneath her sweater. "You're staring again," she said, echoing the words she'd used on him in his office all those months ago. "I'm thinking," he said. "About the company?" "No." He turned, eyes warm in a way the city had never been allowed to see, reserved entirely for her. "About the fact that 10 years ago, I told myself love was a weakness men in my position couldn't survive. And now I am standing here, about to become a father, married to a woman who taught me that the only real weakness was ever believing that closeness made a man fragile instead of whole." Zora rested her hand over his, both of them resting now against the quiet evidence of everything that had grown from one rainy night, one ruined dress, one man who refused to let a woman fall, not just from a curb, but from the belief that she had ever been too much, too old, too anything other than exactly enough. "Minho was wrong about a lot of things," she said softly. "But he was most wrong about that. He gave me the greatest gift of his life without meaning to," Sungjun said. "He let you go." Outside, Seoul moved on the way it always had, indifferent, glittering, full of stories that would never know how close danger had come to swallowing this one whole, and how completely, instead, it had simply made room for love to win. Several months later, in a quiet hospital room far from boardrooms and shell companies and every shadow that had once threatened to take her from him, Han Sungjun held his daughter for the first time, hands that had built and dismantled empires trembling around something far smaller and far more important than any of it, while Zora watched the most feared man in Seoul undone completely, finally, and forever, by something soft. "She has your eyes," Zora whispered. "She has your courage," he answered. "I only hope I'm worthy of teaching her the rest." And in that small, ordinary room, far from the rain where it all began, two people who had once believed they were too broken, too late, too much, or not enough, finally understood that love had never been about deserving it. It had only ever been about choosing it, every single day, for each other, and they did.